Welcome to the Seed podcast named Survive and Thrive, something you know all about, James. I'm really, really excited to have James Downs with me today. James is a public speaker, a eating disorder advocate, brilliant voice for lived experience and mental health. He also does a bit of writing and does yoga and dance. I mean, you are an all-rounder, James, but thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. In fact, you must be doing a good job with your lived experience eating disorder expertise, because the reason we at Seed reached out to you is because you were really, really present, especially on our Twitter feed when it came to discussions around eating disorders. And some of the things that you spoke about and the way you viewed your lived experience really resonated with me and Seed. And what I found really beautiful about it, if that's the right word, is that even though you and I know that an eating disorder is hell on earth, you portray such hope. And I think that's really important. So thank you. And we're going to kind of do like two parts. It sounds really contrived, but the before and the after.
Okay.
But hopefully not so much. But I tell you what, we'll start with. I just want to know if, away from the eating disorder and maybe a time before it even began, did you feel like you were different in any way, or you kind of stood out from the crowd, whether that felt like it was a positive thing or a negative thing? Like, how were sort of things when pre the years that you started to struggle?
That's a really good question, I think, and it sort of hits the nail on the head a little bit without you really knowing, what I was like as a child or anything. Because I think that there was a point when I was growing up that I did feel like I was very different, or I was going through something that other people couldn't understand. So that made me feel different. And I think that's probably at the heart of when I developed my problems with food and eating. But before that, I remember that I was a really free child and sort of really comfortable in my own skin. I used to wear anything. Like, I would always dress up in the girls' clothes as a child, and my mum would tell my sister, like, just let him wear the dresses, because you know how upset James gets when he can't wear the dresses, which I thought was really funny. And I was just so comfortable in my own skin and who I was. And then something obviously like profoundly changed, and it's quite interesting because people who knew me when I was like a little toddler or young child say that I was so at home and so at peace with myself that it was so surprising that I then developed these really difficult problems with food and my body image and everything. But something did change, and I think that's around the time I went to high school. And it's just so funny that you asked the question like that, because I think that this feeling of being different or somehow on my own was the main part of my experience. And I felt like nobody understood what was going on for me. And when I went to high school, I really struggled to feel like I belonged at all. And I went to a school where like not many people were very academic, and I was really interested in learning, and I was quite bright, and that was just not seen to be normal, and I was picked on quite a lot for that, and picked on for my appearance, and quite heavily bullied, really, in a way that made me feel really ashamed for who I was and how I was. And a lot of that focused on my appearance, because I was quite a tall, sort of lanky child, because I had puberty really early, which is another thing that made me feel like I really stood out. Like, my voice broke in primary school, and lots of other things happened as well, which is really young for a boy. And I felt like nobody else was going through this at the same time as me, and I didn't have anybody I could talk to about all these changes to my body and all these changes with going to high school and not feeling like I fitted in socially. So I think that if I had to choose just a few words to describe that experience, which is when all the eating problems started, it was feeling different. It was feeling isolated, feeling alienated, actually. I remember feeling like I'm just, there must be something wrong with me. There must be something particularly wrong with me, that I'm having all these problems and nobody around me could see them. And also, like, I didn't see anybody around me who had similar kinds of issues. And I developed OCD and anorexia when I was around sort of 15. I was diagnosed, but in the years before that, when I look back, I can see that I was getting all these symptoms that I didn't understand what they were. And then once I was diagnosed, that was a big relief in one sense.
Mm.
But it didn't actually take away this feeling of being really different, because being a young teenage boy with anorexia, I didn't feel like anybody else had that. Although we know that that people of all different kinds of backgrounds have eating problems, but because I couldn't see anybody, whether it was around me or in services or in the media, who had stories like mine, I felt like I must be sort of uniquely kind of bad or uniquely mad, to have these experiences. So I suppose this feeling different made me feel more lonely, more isolated, and eating disorders thrive on isolation, and they're really lonely experiences in the first place. So it sort of they fed into each other, I think, and made me retreat more and more into the eating problem.
It's only since I've started doing this podcast series, because I've always been like the one who's been interviewed and then like stood up and spoken. And it's only since we started doing this that I'm sort of, and please take this the right way, I'm sort of relieved, because your story, even though we're both so different and so individual, your story about, especially that bit about how you were so carefree and really confident, and I was like the opposite. I used to dress like the lads, didn't care, just playing football. And that thing of hearing you say that, where you're like, God, I'm lucky, like my parents are so supportive, and then you hit puberty, and I hit puberty early as well, and everything felt like it changed. And it's just kind of like there's such a big sense of relief hearing you say that, selfishly from my point of view, because you spend years, don't you, sort of thinking, what have I done wrong what have I done to hurt other people? Like, what is so bad about me that people are treating me this way? And then actually, it's sad that we have to go through it, but it's not until now that we go, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. Like, I was just very fortunate, but unfortunately that brings about a certain amount of fear from other people, jealousy, which is a horrible thing at times, because it can destroy people. But it's just really interesting to hear you sort of express it in that way. I guess when you say that, when you got diagnosed at 15, like, had it been a few years before you'd even thought to approach services? Because like one of the things that I went through was that we did go to services, but we got turned away because I wasn't low enough in weight. However, the other thing is, like you say, if you don't know what an eating disorder is, and it's just something's just changing in your mind, it's so hard to address. And I guess that's why, the eating disorder educational toolkit that we've got at Seed, I feel so passionate about, because if I'd have known what it was, I wouldn't have felt so scared and confused and fearful of what I should do, and that I was quite right in going, I'm struggling and I need help. But I guess like when things started for you, was it a good few years, or like did you just feel like lost? Did you speak to your parents?
I think there's a few things in there. I think if you do go to get help because you recognize there's a problem, and then you get turned away because for some reason you're not unwell enough, which, I think that doesn't really make much sense to me, because we know that people can be really psychologically unwell, even if they're not physically like at death's door. And we don't want people to live with that kind of suffering. And I think that, I could talk all day about that, but that's one thing, isn't it, where you recognize there is a problem. And there's a huge harm actually in being turned away, because then you think, well, my problems aren't serious enough, and that can feed into that feeling of alienation that we were talking about earlier. But on the other hand, there's not recognizing there's a problem, and that was definitely where I was, because I didn't know that there was really anything wrong in terms of my mental health. I just felt that it was my own personal problem.
Yeah.
And I can recognize now, looking back, that I had a lot of eating disorder behaviors going on since about the age of 10, 11.
Yeah.
I went to high school in particular, but I didn't know that that was an eating disorder, and even stuff around my body image that went back before then. And so I guess the seeds of these things like go back quite far, and then they just need the right conditions perhaps to pop up. And that's what happened to me. But then there's another whole stage of recognizing, oh, actually, this is a real problem. And for me, that only happened once it was so obvious that it was a problem that like people around me finally noticed.
Yeah.
Because like we were saying earlier, like on paper, you can have everything going for you. And on paper, I had all top grades. Like I looked like I was going to be doing fine. I had been like a carefree child, and I had other like abilities like music and stuff. And I suppose nobody would have thought that anything would go wrong for me.
Yeah.
But it can happen to anybody, and it doesn't matter about your background or how clever you are, or you know how supportive your family are. But it was when I was 15, I'd ended up missing pretty much like a whole year of school because I had such like extreme worries about my body image and my appearance. This was sort of tangled up with the OCD, which is why I was diagnosed with OCD first, that I couldn't actually go into school in the end. And I would take hours and hours to get ready to go to school. And I would walk to the school, and in the end, I couldn't walk on the roads because I thought if cars saw me, they might crash their car because I was so ugly. And for me, that was all really real. And I couldn't get into the building in the end. So I would walk around the city, come back at 3 o'clock, even in the winter when I wasn't eating and I was just like freezing, and just pretend that I'd been to school. And that happened for nearly a whole year. And then like parents' evening happened, and the teachers were like, well, where's James been? And everyone was really angry because my parents didn't know anything about it. They felt embarrassed, obviously. And you know, of course they would. But I think then it all sort of came out that, oh, this is actually a problem that I need to get help for.
Yeah.
And then I went to get help, and I managed to see child and adolescent services quite quickly, but that was for the OCD.
Right.
And when I was there, like the eating got a lot worse and got a lot worse. And I sort of spiraled even though I was in the services, and there was no specialist eating disorder treatment in the area at the time. So in the end, it was more than 6 years after I was diagnosed with anorexia that I actually had treatment for the eating disorder, which is a really long time. And sort of by that point, it was such a part of who I was and really entrenched that it was really, really hard to treat.
Yeah.
So there are problems in getting into services in the first place, but then sometimes when you get there, the experience isn't very good. And what we need, I think, if people with eating disorders are going to have a good chance of recovery, is sort of to get in for people to spot the signs and help you to spot the signs. Like I wish that my school understood about mental health, because when they sort of found out that this was OCD, not me just being badly behaved, they just didn't know how to help. And there was a lot of confrontation, and they still thought that I wasn't coming to school because I was badly behaved,
Right.
even though it was a mental health problem. And they didn't know how to support me. My family didn't know how to support me. They're not specialists, but you know, there were just no resources available. And you don't need to be a specialist to help somebody, but you do need a bit of information and a bit of education. And so I think that like all of these pieces have to come together if people are going to recover. Like people spotting the signs, being able to access treatment at the right time, and then for the treatment to actually be good as well. And then you might have a good chance. But I think for so many people, and definitely in my experience, those things don't come together at the right time. And also, like, you know, eating disorders are really powerful. And the times when I have really wanted to recover, the services haven't been there for me. And the times when I have sort of not really wanted to recover because I haven't been confident, or my self-esteem has been really low, I've just thought, you know, it's impossible, I'll never recover. That's when I managed to access services, and I wasn't in the best place to sort of engage. So I think that it's a number of things that people need. And at the moment, I think we're quite a long way away from that being the reality for people. So that's why I do the campaigning that I do, because I think that there could be a different story about eating disorders, like a really positive, hopeful one that unfortunately we don't have at the moment because so many people have difficult experiences. But I do think it could be different. I do think that we could
And do
change.
you know what, James? Like, it's so frustrating sometimes, but actually, it's also like because you and I have been there, it isn't as excuse me, it isn't as difficult as what people perceive it to be. Like, there are really simple things that can be done to change the way eating disorders are viewed. And like, you know, you raised the point of you had OCD as well as the eating disorder. Like, there's so many, an eating disorder can manifest itself along with so many other issues. And like, there's a big link with autism. You know, OCD comes up a lot. I know that I went through a bout of it, not as much as you, but you know, that thing of trying to fixate and control something. You know, it's so strong within people with eating disorders. And then the other side of it, in terms of like, there's a reason why, and I'm laughing because it's just like, when I say it, you'll be like, yeah, because it's so like it should just be known. There's a reason why those who develop anorexia then go on to develop bulimia and other compensatory behaviours. And one of the reasons, well, mine was definitely, was that when I did get help, like you say, when I was in the system, the first thing I got taught about was calories, was fat content. And I also just got told to eat, without actually addressing what was going on for me underneath. And because I was just forced to eat, well, then I'm going to find another way to let the eating disorder thrive, which is awful to say it like that. But when the eating disorder is so strong and it's not being challenged, but the physical side is, you know, where's it going to end? But I mean, I think the one thing that we always say at Seed is like, talking to the person as a person is so important as well. You know, and finding out who James is and what's going on for him, but also what makes him happy, what, you know, what does he like to talk about, what is, you know, trying to re-engage and remember who that person was. And I mean, I did a talk yesterday, and it struck me. I got asked a question and I thought, I'm going to ask James this, and it kind of links in with what we were talking about, you know, perceptions and compensatory behavior and hiding behind things. Did you ever pretend or try and have people perceive that you were doing okay, so that you didn't worry people and you didn't feel a burden? And somebody asked me that yesterday, one of the girls at the sixth form, and I was like, whoa, what a question. So I hope you don't mind me throwing it in there and asking.
No, that's fine. I did my master's not too long ago in secondary schools, asking pupils lots of questions about mental health, and like the stuff that people come up with is just like, I'm like, these young people are enlightened, like, and some of the questions they ask that are so spot on. But yeah, I definitely pretended that I had recovered for a really long time, or I felt so guilty about taking up space, and I felt so guilty and ashamed for having an eating problem, because I think I'd been treated as though I was badly behaved and as though it was my fault. And I had a lot of difficult experiences with doctors and services where they said, you know, like, basically you're being selfish, or you understand what you're doing to yourself, why are you doing it? And I think that conditioned me to just, if anything, to make myself even smaller, which was the kind of problem in the first place. And I think that I wanted to please everybody around me because I felt so guilty about what I put them through. I can't imagine what it would be like for a mother to watch their child starving, when everything about your biology as a mother must be to feed your child. Like, that must be just unbelievably difficult. And I feel so sorry for my mum. And I understand it wasn't my fault now, but at the time I just felt I couldn't help, you know, I couldn't help but feel really guilty. And I think that, yeah, when I finally got a bit more support, and I was sort of made to gain weight, and sort of forced basically to eat. And they always said, you know, if you don't eat this, we'll section you. If you don't drink this, we'll section you, which isn't a positive motivation to recover. It's just scaring you from, you know, not getting worse. I think that I wanted to just be the gold star patient who would recover and be, you know, a real success story for the people who were treating me, and I wanted to please them. because I wasn't getting that in other areas of my life, or I wasn't able to achieve in school because I couldn't go to school anymore, or I wasn't able to, do the things I wanted to anymore because I was so unwell. So I think there was this thing about people pleasing that's lasted and stayed with me for a really long time. And I think that over the years, more recently, that's been a really big thing for me to work on, that I don't have to serve everybody else all of the time and be all things to all people at all times, because that was drilled into me from a young age. And it's kind of also my cultural background in my family, because my dad's a teacher, my mum's a priest, and like serving other people is like really important. And I do believe that, but it doesn't mean that you have to forget about yourself completely and just be really guilty for having basic needs. And I think that sort of almost sort of led me to this idea that I wasn't really worth taking up space and attention and receiving care, and that I just had to care for other people. And that led me to lots of really difficult relationships and stuff that really harmed my mental health when I was older. So I think there's
oh my God, like this is so weird. Like, are we
but there's a huge overlap, and it's sort of like you said that I think that is a really important point to sort of ask somebody, well, what do they want their life to be like as well? And that's something that I didn't get. And like you were saying, well, what do you like? What do you enjoy? What do you love? Why would you want to recover in the first place? Like when I was in services when I was younger, they were always saying, somebody said, you'll never recover from this. You'll live with it for the rest of your life. Or, this is something that will stay with you forever. And if you don't, the reason to get better is so you don't die. Like if you keep doing this, you're gonna kill yourself. And what I would have loved would have been somebody to say, well, what are the positive reasons to get better and to recover? And nobody said that. And I didn't hear the words recovery is possible until I was 21. And that was 6 years later. And it was a charity event. And my mind was blown because I'd never ever heard that. And it's the same with this idea of like, well, you can take up space as well, or it can be about what you want as well. Whereas I'd sort of then ended up in this situation of just thinking I had to care for everybody else. And that's also a way of avoiding yourself in a sense, because I would pour myself into these relationships, or I worked as a carer for years in a nursing home, like 70 hours a week, because I didn't have to think about myself, because I could just please everybody else and care for everybody else, and then maybe give myself just a few little bits of food, but not too much, just little sort of crumbs, really. But I don't think we want a life of crumbs, really. When we think deep down, and I don't, we might think that's what we deserve, but I don't think that anybody deserves that. And I think, a big realization for me was like, who am I not to have a good life? Who am I not to recover? Who am I not to go and have that great holiday, or to eat what I like, those kind of things, because I always felt like I wasn't worth it. But I then had to realize, no, like you would never speak to your friend like that, you would never speak to somebody else like that, so why are you talking to yourself like that all of the time?
Oh, I love that. And it's like, you raise a point about treatment as well, in terms of the detrimental effect that can have if it's not delivered right. So you say about like the reward. I like you spent my life in and out of eating disorder units and God knows what else, and it was all about reward and punishment. So I spent my life feeling like everything was going to be taken away. So I had to give it all. I had to give, please, 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 because if I did something wrong, it would be gone. And like you say, James, without being too personal, you touched on the fact that it had impacted relationships, and absolutely the same. Absolutely, like some of the relationships I've been in have been so abusive and so like mentally abusive, but because holding my hand up, I was so programmed to think that was acceptable, and and that was what a relationship should be. I was there to just please and love, like unconditional love, like it didn't matter, no matter what was said to me or how I was hurt. And I think it's probably like a podcast for another day, but like there's definitely a duty of care within the way eating disorders are treated that impacts on their later life, because like you, I'm still like realizing who I am and what is not okay and what's okay. And you said something on your Instagram that just blew me away the other week, and it was about how your recovery is your recovery and it's your discovery. And I was just like, I was just blown away by it, because it made me realize, like, there is no right or wrong with this. And I just found it so hopeful and so beautiful. Like, where did that come from? Like, thank you for one, but where did that, you know, your recovery is your discovery. Like, we love a good rhyme, survive and thrive, but you know, in all seriousness, that really, at 36 years old, that really just blew my mind, because I was like, that's it, that is it.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the positive side of things, I guess. And like we were saying about these difficult things about services and about treatment, and that stuff is very, very real, and it has like lasting consequences. That's true. But I think I'm always passionate about, you know, whilst you can say the negative stuff, you have to provide the positive solution, I guess. And for me, talking about recovery, I think that it's something that was always put in really narrow terms for me. And I was told that recovery is when you gain weight, for example. And like you said, well, if you don't address the underlying issues, and nobody, I felt, saw any of the underlying issues for me, then it's so likely that you'll just sort of replace one set of behaviors with another. And like I went from anorexia into bulimia, a really common experience, and compulsive exercise and all these things. And because I couldn't have a space to address or talk about the underlying stuff. And so I suppose I realized that, well, what they're telling me recovery is, which is just gaining weight and you'll be fine, that's not true, or that's not enough. And so what is it? And nobody's really been able to tell me the answer. And I think maybe there isn't an answer that works for everybody. I mean, you can go on social media and see like amazing people doing really positive stuff and promoting their own recoveries and promoting recovery in communities online and stuff. But I think that there is quite a narrow view of what a sort of narrow presentation of what that looks like. And there aren't many men, for example, doing that. And, you know, if you don't like to go for coffee and a cake, which seems to be like the recovery, but like, I just really don't like cake. And that is not the eating disorder speaking, because I really love other high fat foods, and you know, I have the things that I love and the things that I don't, but I just really don't like it. Like I just don't like it. And so like for me, thinking recovery is being able to go and share on Instagram that you had a piece of cake today. Well, I'm like, well, that's not my recovery.
Yeah.
So all of these things pointing to me, like, being like, well, that's not my recovery. That's not my recovery. I can't see somebody who looks like me. It's not just about gaining weight. What is it about then? And I'm just like, well, then that just means it's something that I have to create for myself. And it's what, you know, on my terms, what is that recovery? And that's so liberating when you've always been told sort of, you know, this is what's wrong with you and this is how you need to get better. Or when you've been sort of forced to have treatment when you really didn't want it, and you didn't have that freedom, or you had that freedom taken away from you, or that punishment. And I suppose creativity for me is a real part of who I was when I was that free sort of child, and it's what I always loved when I was growing up. And it's something that left me completely when I was really ill, because I just didn't have the mental space or the concentration or the ability to do all the creative things that I love. And so I suppose that that's all coming back to me now. And I think that I've looked like I've recovered for a very long time because I've been a normal weight for a long time. But like you said, like even as you get into your 30s and still there are things that you're learning and discovering about yourself. And so it's like recovery, which I thought was A to B, is just like this never ending sort of journey. And that's really scary in some ways, because there's no control, or you don't know where it's going to take you. But it's also like full of opportunity and can be whatever you want it to be. And nobody should tell you what it is, I suppose. I think that it's got to be on your terms, because then it's more meaningful. And that question of like, well, what do I want my life to be like? And what do I want to stand for? And then especially if you've spent your whole life like giving to everybody else all the time, we found it really difficult to receive or to ask for help. I think seeing that, no, I'm worth thinking about what it is for myself.
Yeah.
I think that's a really big, frightening and exciting journey.
Yeah, well, in that life, you know, but I just, you know, I think so many people watching, and including myself, just thank you for that reminder, because it's so important. And I guess speaking more about recovery in the next stage of your life, like whenever that ends, or whatever, you know, when did you feel like for me, I remember there was a distinct moment that I was like, I can't do this anymore.